It was late in the day. The sun was setting behind him, but for some reason, Alexander didn't relish the thought of spending the night anywhere on the Isle of the Crown. He headed through the archway down the ferry road back toward the docks, but about the time he reached the garden in front of Beauty's house, he realized he'd made a mistake. I should be using this map at the beach, not the docks. And besides, more from the Johannes Bay may have washed ashore. Shrugging, Alexander retraced his steps. When he returned to the village, Hakim was just leaving the shop with a large armload of trash, which he dumped into the pot beside the door. He waved when he saw Alexander and went back inside, shutting up the shop for the night. Feeling a little sheepish, Alexander went over to see what had been thrown out. "You never know," he thought, quoting another favorite proverb of his father's. Something that Hakim had no use for might be very useful to Alexander. But this did not seem to be the case today. All Alexander found discarded in the pot were things like fake thumbs and exploding cigars, and a bottle. It was a small black bottle with a glass stopper. Alexander couldn't imagine why it had been discarded. He shook it and felt liquid slosh inside. Ink? He tried to open it, but the stopper seemed stuck fast. He continued tugging, and after one last gigantic wrench from Alexander, the bottle surrendered. It was ink. It was also everywhere, splashing from the bottle to liberally anoint Alexander's face and tunic. As he looked for stains, the ink-splattered portions of Alexander's anatomy faded from view. He was still staring, drop-jawed, as they reappeared, fading slowly back into view. So, invisible ink. The magic must be almost gone. That's why Hakim was throwing it out. Still, I didn't spill it all, and what's left just might be useful. Tucking the ink bottle, now securely stoppered, into his pocket, Alexander headed back to the beach where he had first washed ashore. To Alexander's disappointment, there was no new debris on the shore. After a few moments of fruitless searching, he finally opened the map and concentrated on the image of the island in the top center of the map, the Isle of the Sacred Mountain, wondering what lay ahead of him there. He touched the shape of the island with a fingertip, and as he did, he felt a blurring, floating feeling. The world was obscured in a blue mist, and suddenly, he was there. Or at least he was somewhere else. Alexander stood on a beach even smaller than the one he had left. Sheer rock cliffs, unclimbable by any means Alexander could see, ringed the semicircle of sand. The sand at his feet was cluttered with shells, crabs, and partially devoured seabirds. But in addition to those, there were two other things: a sea-wet flower and a black feather as long as his arm. Alexander had, he realized, absolutely no way of knowing where he was, only that he was no longer on the Isle of the Crown. For the Isle of the Crown had no cliffs this size anywhere upon its surface. He gazed up the cliff and up and up and up to where its crags disappeared into the sky. The guidebook had mentioned heights like these nowhere else in the land of the Green Isles. Until he could find someone to ask, Alexander decided to assume that the map functioned just as Hakim had promised, and that he was standing on the Isle of the Sacred Mountain. Looking about himself, Alexander picked up the feather and realized that, with a thrill, that it certainly had come from no mortal bird. Versed in the arcane arts, Alexander easily discerned that this feather might very well be from the fabled Nightmare, a winged steed that can fly between the pleasant world of men and the dread realms of the Lord of Death himself. He carefully tucked the feather away and wondered if he would get a chance to see Nightmare herself. Then he picked up the flower. It was a rose, Alexander saw, though strangely colored, so he raised it to his nose to inhale its fragrance, and nearly dropped it. The flower had a strong perfume, all right, but The scent was worse than that emanating from the castle of trains at high summer. Alexander held the stinking rose at arm's length, thinking of tossing it into the sea. It was the memory of his grandfather that stopped him. Alexander had never known Sir Hereward, for that gallant old knight had died many years before Alexander was born, lost to the border wars that characterized the turbulent end of old King Edward's reign. But the wisdom Sir Hereward had passed on to his son had always been a part of King Graham's life, and of Alexander's, ever since he had returned to Daventry. The words themselves were woven into a great tapestry that hung upon the wall of the great hall, wherein King Graham and Queen Valenice sat in judgment at such times as their royal duties required. Upon the tapestry it said, "If I have learned anything in my life, I have learned this. Pick up anything that is not nailed down. If it is, check for loose nails or boards. Check carefully into, under, above, below, and behind things. Read everything. You might learn something. Wear clean undergarments, brush after meals, and always remember, nothing is as it appears." Alexander regarded the stinking rose, thinking that he had almost made a mistake. He carefully tucked the flower away. Odd ingredients are often useful in spells, and even the most unpleasant find could be useful someday. Had not his own father, King Graham of Daventry, successfully used a custard pie, a rotten fish, and a dry stick to rescue his family from the clutches of the evil wizard Mordack? I must be more careful. If nothing is as it appears, then even the most useless-seeming thing can be of use. Resolved to pry loose anything that wasn't nailed down, and to check for loose nails if it was, a weary Alexander rolled himself into his cloak and slept his first night in the land of the Green Isles. The morning found Alexander fit, rested, and very hungry. Since the Isle of the Sacred Mountain didn't seem to offer much in the way of breakfast or travel, Alexander decided to try his luck elsewhere. He faced the water, opened the map, concentrated, and touched the small comma-shaped isle at the bottom left corner of the map. Once more he felt the map's spell overcome him, and when he opened his eyes again, he was in the most peculiar place he'd ever seen. Even the light had a curious flatness to it, as if it had been applied with a large brush, and everything he saw was as brightly colored as the frescoes on the castle walls of Daventry. A bright golden beach swept up to the verge of an emerald green jungle, and even the water was a flat, bright turquoise. Looking down, Alexander saw a flicker at the edge of the water. He reached down and picked up a sentence. Well, part of one anyway. Holding the brightly colored words up to the light, he read, "Where are you?" What could that mean? Alexander wondered. It gave him an odd feeling to hold a sentence in his hands without the benefit of a letter or a book. Tucking it away, he decided to think about his catch later, after he explored further. Each step Alexander took seemed to produce new wonders. A little up in the beach, he saw a tiny cluster of doll-sized beds with tiny Z's drifting up from them. In each bed lay an enormous oyster, most of them snoring soundly. Oyster beds, of course. Without doubt, this is the oddest place I've ever been. Looking closer, he saw that one of the oysters wasn't asleep. It was sitting on the edge of its bed, and had the most doleful expression Alexander had ever seen, especially on an oyster. "Hello, little oyster," Alexander said. "Is something wrong?" "I can't sleep. My mouth hurts, and I'm so tired," the oyster wailed. As it spoke, Alexander could see a flash of pearl white inside its mouth. "Perhaps I could see what is wrong," Alexander ventured, but the oyster merely shook its head. Considering Alexander's own experiences with the former court dentist of Daventry, he found he couldn't blame it, but he was certain that something in the oyster's mouth was causing its distress. I'm so tired, the little creature wailed again. Perhaps I could read to you, Alexander suggested. If the book the bookshop owner had given him for free was as boring as it had seemed, it ought to be able to put anything to sleep. Oh yes, I'd like that, said the oyster. It settled down on its bed to hear a story, and Alexander sat down and began to read. Within paragraphs, the oyster was yawning, and Alexander, despite a night's rest, thought he might well fall asleep himself. He forced himself to stay awake and continued to read, biding his time. And when the oyster opened its mouth in a real jaw-cracking yawn, Alexander pounced on the pearl and snatched it away. Oh, the oyster said in surprise, that feels much better. He was asleep almost instantly. Of course, when a tooth puller is done, one almost always feels better. Alexander looked down at the enormous pearl he held in his hand. The oyster certainly didn't want it. Perhaps Hakim the pawnbroker would let him exchange it for his ring. Alexander got to his feet. If he stayed in the oyster beds much longer, he'd fall asleep too. He started inland toward the interior of the island, but stopped when he heard chanting. We are the guardians of the Isle of Wonder. We guard her with all her might. Our senses are quite keen by day and twice as keen at night. Marching toward him in rhythmic cadence was a short procession of 5 of the strangest creatures he'd seen this morning, which was saying much, considering that Alexander had spent the morning on the Isle of Wonder. One had an enormous nose, the next enormous ears, another enormous mouth, still another enormous hands, and finally one with enormous eyes. One creature for each of the 5 common senses. They could only be gnomes, although very odd ones, and to make sense of their exaggerated appearances, Alexander silently named them sense gnomes. That no intruder will escape, we peek and poke and pry. Then we catch them and we kill them, and our day prey is doomed to die. We are the guardians of the Isle of Wonder, the little creatures chanted on and on. Our prey is doomed to die? Not very appealing, Alexander thought, but even less appealing was the thought of giving up before he had even begun to explore the land of the Green Isles. Somehow he must get past these creatures, but what did he have that could baffle each of the 5 senses these guardians of the Isle of Wonder were about to turn on him? Frantically, Alexander searched his pockets, then sighed in slim, resigned hope. As he stood in the shadow of the large rock by the seaside, the gnomish creatures paraded up to him and stood in a solemn single file. Alexander knew he had no choice but to deceive each of them and their overdeveloped senses. He prayed that his ruses would succeed. To the first gnome, bereft of all senses save smell, Alexander offered the overpowering scent of the stinking rose, and the guardian could smell no human. For the second gnome, who had enormous ears, Alexander played the tin nightingale he had purchased at the pawn shop, and the guardian could hear no human. When the third gnome unrolled an enormous tongue, Alexander placed the mint he had planned to eat upon it, and the guardian could taste no human. The fourth gnome stretched out his sensitive hands, and Alexander placed the ferryman's rabbit's foot in them, and the guardian could feel no human. And just before the fifth gnome opened his big blue eyes to look all around, Alexander poured the entire bottle of invisible ink over himself and stood completely motionless, not daring even to breathe, and the final guardian could see no human at all. "Morons!" shrilled the last gnome. "Idiots! Is everybody here crazy but me? There isn't anything on this beach at all! Why are all of you wasting my time?" He continued to grumble as he led the others away. "Hope I've seen the last of them," Alexander thought as the gnomes disappeared, then chuckled at the turn of phrase. The ink faded away and Alexander reappeared. He looked up and down the beach and decided to go east, wondering what wonder he'd see next. The next wonder seemed to be reasonably mundane. Books. But piles of books out in the middle of nowhere. A library graveyard. Maybe one of these is rare enough to gain me Howren's spell book, Alexander thought, placing a hand on the center and tallest pile of the books. "Who's there?" a thin, quavery voice demanded, and out of the tallest pile appeared a bookworm. How did I guess? The bookworm was small and green and wore thick glasses that glinted in the sun. It swayed back and forth before Alexander's eyes like a diminutive leaf-green cobra, chanting words in its high-piping voice that almost made sense. "Excuse me," Alexander says. "I'm looking for a rare book." "Books we have in plenty. They're a treasure that is great. And if you want to gain one, just speak up. Don't hesitate." Doesn't matter what book, just as long as it's rare. Alexander said hopefully. "These books have been here so long that they're all quite well done." "You haven't seen my dangling participle, have you?" the bookworm asked anxiously. Apparently it was not prepared to give Alexander a book just then. "No, I haven't," Alexander said, "but I'll look for it. After all, if I picked up a sentence fragment today, finding a dangling participle should be as easy as an ill-constructed pun. If anything else, the conundrum will provide new food for thoughts as I travel. And not much else." The idea of food reminded Alexander that breakfast was still in his future, and since he didn't seem to be accomplishing anything where he was, he bid farewell to the bookworm, retraced his steps to the beach, and headed inland. Just north of the beach, the jungle took on a distinctly swampy aspect. The trees, and even the logs on the ground, all seemed to have disturbingly human faces. And that was far from being the oddest thing he encountered in the bog. As he headed along the path, he heard a faint, glassy chiming in front of him. When he looked, he saw milk bottles growing on stalks at the base of a large tree. Milkweed, Prince Alexander thought to himself, pleased at the surmise. Woof! Woof! Above him, the tree's bark turned flesh, barked at my prince, and then to the branch-obscured sky. Bow! Bow! It continued, until the temporary countenance hardened once more into wood. A dogwood, of course, Alexander groaned. Once he rounded the turn in the path, Alexander realized where the punning plants must have come from, for he found himself in the living pun garden. The crab apples clicked their claws and waved their antennae. The buttercups had real butter in their cups, and the snapdragons defended themselves with very sharp teeth. Wallflowers blushed shyly along the brick wall at the back of the garden, and more. At the end of the pun garden, the way was barred by a large yellow and red polka-dotted doors. Beyond that must be chessboard land, where, according to the guidebook to the land of the Green Isles, the queens Blanche and Rafina, the rulers of this domain, resided. Alexander continued looking about the garden. On the left side of the path was a nursery of pink and blue-faced babies' breaths and babies' tears dozing in the morning sun, and next to them were curling green vines covered with red, ripe tomatoes, except for the one at the very bottom. As Alexander looked closer, he saw that these vegetables had faces too. "Hello, little fellow," Alexander said to the fallen tomato. "What are you doing here?" "I'm lying on the ground rotting, High Pockets. What do you think?" the tomato sneered. "Well, grandfather, it isn't nailed down." Ignoring the tomato's squalls and shrieks, Alexander scooped it up and carefully added to his growing collection of extremely strange salvage. But breakfast was still nowhere in sight, and Alexander had no intention of eating something with a face, much less something with a face that could talk. He looked around the garden for something that might fit his rather exacting requirements. He thought he'd found it when he reached the lettuce patch, but The lettuce he plucked turned out to be iceberg lettuce, and a 3-pound ball of green ice wasn't Alexander's idea of breakfast either. Giving up on the pun garden, Alexander wrapped the lettuce in his cloak, tucked it under his arm, and returned to the beach to try his luck elsewhere. The lettuce hadn't been nailed down, but it was still chilly. This time, he chose the Isle of the Beast. When the enchantment faded, Alexander was standing once more on a beach. On this island, the forest began almost immediately. Alexander took a well-marked path inland, but soon his progress was halted, this time by a wide, broad pool lying across the path. There was no way to get around it. Alexander had just made up his mind to get his feet wet when he took a second look. And this time, he saw tiny bubbles rising through the water, and wisps of steam dancing upon its surface. Moist heat brought the sheen of sweat to his face. If I step into that, I'll certainly be in hot water. Alexander thought about the rapidly melting iceberg lettuce he carried. It's worth a try, he decided, and tossed it into the water. There was a moment's enormous hissing and roiling, and when it subsided, Alexander knelt and gently stuck his finger into the water. The pool was still pretty hot, but bearable. Alexander waded quickly and was able to make it across without getting cooked. At the far side of the hot water, Alexander saw an old brass lantern hanging from the branch of a tree. It was battered and dented, and its interior contained a thin brown sludge that Alexander identified after a few sniffs as tea leaves. Someone had been using the kettle-shaped lantern as a teapot, and fairly recently, possibly with water from the boiling pond. Alexander shook his head in bemusement, then took it down from the tree. With no hesitation, he added it to his collection and continued on his way, soon coming to a gray stone wall at the edge of an enormous rose garden. The path led between a pair of formidable stone pillars, topped with statues of archers. As Alexander approached, the statues seemed to quiver, and Alexander could have sworn he saw one carven eye roll in its stone socket to follow him. Come in! Come in! Oh, don't mind those old statues, they're harmless, and I can tell you the way to reach the castle of the beast! The voice came from behind the stone wall. Alexander stopped and regarded the man who had spoken. He was kneeling in the dirt a few feet inside the gate, his hands busy in the dirt. From his dress and his activity, the man seemed to be a gardener. Come on in, don't be shy. I can tell you everything you need to know, the gardener urged again. Let it never be said that Prince Alexander of Daventry is one to pass up an opportunity to increase his store of knowledge. On the other hand, he's nobody's fool. After one full day in the land of the Green Isles, he'd learned quite a number of things, not all of them good. As the gardener glared at Alexander with impatience, his eyes glinted yellow in the forest light. And Alexander decided he didn't want to go through the gate right away after all. Alexander glanced away, since if he did not go through the gate, there seemed no place else for him to go. And when he looked back, the gardener was nowhere to be seen. Still, Alexander had seen something useful. On the grass, just outside of the gate, a lone gray brick lay on the grass. A throwable brick was something that seemed to Alexander to have immediate practical use, so he picked it up. I'm beginning to resemble a sack rat, Alexander thought. I really do hope Grandpa's advice comes in handy soon. Was it only his imagination, or did the eyes of the stone archers gleam with anticipation as he neared the gateway? In any event, Alexander was glad to leave, retracing his steps to return to the beach. Everything was serene when he reached there, yet something was different. For a moment, he couldn't put his finger on the reason, but then he looked up. After a morning spent on the Isle of Wonder, Alexander could hardly say this was the strangest creature he'd seen, but It did its best to become one of the most memorable. It looked like a cross between a possum and an iguana, and its hide was the same curiously flat yet bright color that Alexander associated with everything he had encountered on the Isle of Wonder. "You're not by any chance a dangling participle, are you?" Alexander said to the creature. "Going to! Going to!" the creature cried. Alexander reached for it, but it curled up higher out of reach. Alexander searched through his possessions for something that might tempt the scatter-witted thing to come down. He even thought of throwing the brick at it, but Alexander is by nature a kindly soul who would not choose to use such measures against a creature so much smaller than he. At last, in his rummagings, he encountered the sentence fragment he'd picked up on the Isle of Wonder. It was brightly colored. Perhaps that would interest the creature. Alexander offered the sentence to the creature. "Where are you?" the creature recited. "Where are you?" Then it noticed the sentence fragment, then yelled in joy and fulfillment. "Where are you going to? Where are you going to?" it concluded triumphantly. "Where are you going to now? Can I come too?" it added. The creature leaped into Alexander's arms, squirmed, then wriggled up to and across his shoulders, where it settled with a purr, much like a live fur collar. And thus it was that Alexander of Daventry acquired a dangling participle. From there it was a simple matter to use the magic map to jump back to the Isle of Wonder. The 5 fierce guardians were nowhere to be seen, and after a moment, Alexander turned east toward the book garden. He again placed a hand on the middle of the tower of books to summon the bookworm, and when the creature appeared, Alexander quickly handed it the dangling participle. It's hard to say who was more delighted, the dangling participle to be home again, the bookworm to have its pet back, or Alexander to receive his reward, a rare book such as the bookshop owner back on the Isle of the Crown might well be looking for. And the oyster's pearl, perhaps, would redeem his ring. Alexander glanced at the book he had been given and found it to be a book of riddles. He read aloud. "My first is foremost legally, my second circles outwardly. My third leads all in victory. My fourth twice ends a nominee. It takes but 2 to play at me. This riddle's answer, can you see?" Alexander looked through the book and on the ground for the page with the riddle's answer, but it was gone. When he finally did look up, however, Alexander was staring into the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. All 8 of them, a number that matched the owner's legs. "Hiya, sailor, new in town?" Alexander took a closer look and saw an enormous black widow spider, dressed in lace and leather, sitting in the middle of a web the size of a dinner plate. There were a number of things caught in the web, but the one that attracted Alexander's attention the most was the piece of paper that looked as if it might be the missing page from his riddle book. Alexander started to reach out a hand towards it, and the spider skittered forward eagerly, fangs shining. "I just knew you were my type." Thanks, but we haven't been properly introduced," Alexander said, snatching his hand back as the widow moved closer. As she did, Alexander saw a thread loose in the web. Grasping the thread carefully between thumb and forefinger, he began to tug gently in order to distract the lady killer. "Hey, you big lunk! What do you think you're doing?" The Black Widow scampered back and forth in furious agitation. When she was quite distracted and down near the bottom of the web, Alexander deftly plucked the piece of parchment out of the top. "You give that back!" the spider shrilled. "I only wanted to read it," Alexander said. On the sheet, which did indeed come from the riddle book, was printed the single word love, the answer to the riddle. As Alexander was about to return it to the Black Widow, a vagrant breeze plucked it from its fingers and carried it off to be lost in the island's underbrush. At this point, Alexander decided the best thing to do was leave. Hurrying back to the beach, he again took out the magic map. In a moment, he was standing once more on the Isle of the Crown. In another moment, he was striding back toward the village.